Hi, welcome to Vegan Land. And today we've got an extract of an interview that I did with Ronnie Lee about the prevent strategy. And then we moved on to all sorts of different subjects like neoliberalism, corporate power, system change, grassroots organising. You check it out. I really enjoyed it. It was so much. I learnt so much.
Why animal rights poses such a huge threat to the state in a nation of animal lovers?
A nation of animal lovers in terms of certain animals, I think. It challenges total conditions of existence, doesn't it? It challenges the kind of everything at a very fundamental level. I mean, there are so many businesses that profit from the oppression of animals, and some very powerful businesses, particularly like the pharmaceutical industry. I think the state has been pressurized really by industries into bringing in these measures because, the pharmaceutical industry, which is heavily involved in animal experimentation, is so powerful. For decades and decades, we've had the sort of government that would listen and give in to the will of those industries. That's why, the repression has been particularly bad against anti-vivisection campaigners, because the industry they are up against was massively powerful. When we were doing the protest against the dog track, there were people from the domestic extremism unit, they call themselves, investigating us. But kind of one of the reasons they were doing that was because they were the police force that covered Oxford. And there was a big campaign at the time, the campaign's still going on, by Speak, against experiments at Oxford University. And that was a big focus of the domestic extremism unit in that area, you see. So the reason that they were interested in us demonstrating at Reading was because it was these were, animal rights campaigners operating within their area, and that area included the laboratory at Oxford and the campaign against that. But generally, the campaign against dog racing, there's not been the police repression against that campaign. And the reason, really quite simply for that, is that industry's not very powerful. Compared to the pharmaceutical industry, the vivisection industry, the dog racing industry is nothing. They haven't got the clout to put pressure on government to say you have to repress these people, you have to bring in laws to stop people protesting against side dog tracks, and you've got to kind of, have special police squads to arrest them. They haven't got they've not got the power to do that the pharmaceutical industry has, and that's why there's been so much repression against anti-vivisection activists.
It makes me wonder, because you've got the animal agriculture industry, so-called here, the animal death industry, activists like Saves, you've got the, the sort of the DXCs, or you've got the Cubes, and they don't seem to be getting challenged by the police. They seem to have quite a sort of like chummy relationship with the police. I mean, why do you think that might be?
I don't think that industry is as powerful as the vivisection industry. You haven't got the same big, powerful companies involved in that.
Can I just stop you? I mean, you've got Cargill,
yes,
which is a sort of like a multinational, billionaire-owned, and also the, JBS, the enormous sort of like animal agriculture slaughterhouse industries. I mean, they're huge.
You've got those, but they're not as, the pharmaceutical industry, probably seconds to the arms trade, is probably the most powerful industry in the world. And so, although yes, you are right, there are some big companies involved in the slaughter of animals and the supply of animal products. The reason why veganism, in terms of a diet, really, in terms of people not consuming animal products, is not seen so much of a threat as a threat, is because it's not really a threat to capitalism. It's not really a threat to the kind of really big capitalism, because what we see happening is companies switching from producing animal products to producing vegan products. Some of the major producers of plant milk are dairy companies. And we've got meat companies, Fray Bentos now, they brought out a vegan pie, haven't they? Because you see that they'll move with the times, that they'll say, oh, well, this is the trend, this is the way things, supermarkets, all the vegan products in the supermarkets. None of that's done for ethical reasons. That's done for money, because they see that, this is the way consumption is going. More people are starting to consume that diet, gradually fewer people, certainly in this country, are consuming animal products, or that people are switching over. So we'll go with the flow, because our main interest, we're not interested in whether it's animal products or it isn't animal products. What we're interested in is money. Veganism in terms of a diet is no threat whatsoever to capitalism. Capitalism just adapts to to profit from it. Vegan food, that isn't a threat. They don't see veganism in terms of food, in terms of people stopping consuming animal products. That's not a threat to big business. That's not a threat to kind of the really big businesses at all. They just adapt. What is a threat is if people stop consuming. That's the threat. You see, there's a sense in which the environmental movement, certainly the kind of more radical aspects of the environmental movement, is far more of a threat to capitalism than veganism. Because if people stop consuming, if someone consumes vegan burgers instead of meat burgers, if somebody buys a car that's got non-leather seats instead of leather seats, they're not bothered. People are still buying, they're still consuming, they're still keeping big business going. But if people stop consuming, if people cut down on consumption, that is a threat. That's a threat to them. Movements for against growth, for instance, movements for degrowth of the economy, movements against consumption, against materialism, against industrialization, those things, they're far more of a threat. That's where the threat is to capitalism. It isn't from people consuming a vegan diet.
A fantastic point and some interesting thoughts there. Come back to this sort of like notion of how do we deal with all this? How can we move forward, specifically talking about the prevent strategy? I mean, you've mentioned sort of like being clearer on the terms. Is there anything that we need to be thinking about as activists?
We've got to go very deep with this. We've got to go very deep with this. There's a kind of sense, I think, in which it might be doing us a favour. This might be doing us a favour by forcing us to go deeper. Because you see, why have these measures been brought in? Why has the state continuously done this, all down the years? Why has it done it? And it hasn't just done it to the animal rights movement, it's done it to the environmental movement as well. It's done it to left-wing political movements as well. Why is that happening? The reason it's happening is because the nature of the state. It's because the nature of the state. It's because we have consistently have had governments that are like very pro-capitalism, very pro-neoliberalism, and so they want to repress anyone that challenges that. They see as a challenge in any way to that system. It's the very nature of the state itself that's the problem. Unless we change that, unless we change the type of government we have, this will always be a problem. If we're going to change the type of government we have to deal with that at a very deep level, and we have to deal with that at a level that's far deeper than protest, because protest is kind of very limited in what it changes. And like we've seen huge protests that haven't changed anything. I mean, like you look at the 2 million people marched against the Iraq war. Well, Tony Blair still went ahead and invaded Iraq. Yeah, and a lot of members of my family went. I stayed at home, looked after the animals, but they went off to London and joined in the huge protest. Didn't change anything. Protest can change things. I'm not totally against it, but I think it gives a false it gives kind of people a false sensation. Like people go on a big demo and shout like that and think, oh, well, I've really achieved something today. I went and shouted in London against austerity or something. But like when you really analyse it, well, kind of did that really make a difference when you've got a government that's kind of so hell-bent on a particular ideology? Are like, you know, 1 million people in London, 2 million, 5 million, is that really going to make any difference to them? I don't think so. How many Tories go on demos? Hardly any, unless it's like a Countryside Alliance, you know.
Well, yeah.
When they march to kind of defend hunting, you might get a few Tories on that. But like, they don't, do they? So, like, why do the Tories always get in? You see, there's millions of people in London against austerity, against Trump, against, you know, for all these, you know, worthy left-wing causes. And yet the Tories always get elected. And the reason for that is because the Tory voters sneak out their house, sneak down the ballot box, put the cross in the against the Tory, and then sneak back to their little life again, don't they? That's why they get elected. That kind of gains far more than all those people protesting and demonstrating. And we get the right people that are like in power, you know, in charge. I mean, I don't necessarily, you know, think that our present political system is the best one. I don't agree with the existence of nation states at all. You know, I think one world, one people, but we still needed levels of administration, you know, for society to operate. As a first step, we obviously have to radically change the nature of our government. Who decides, you know, what the government's going to be? Well, voters decide it, don't they? In local constituency, they vote for the member of parliament. So if you want a decent person or a half decent person, even elected to parliament in a particular constituency, you've got to change those ordinary people. You've got to get those ordinary people thinking differently, so that when they go down the ballot box, enough of them vote for the candidate who is best for the animals, is best for the environment, is best for social justice. We have to do our work within local communities. We have to do our work to change the mindset of people, to change ordinary people. People say, oh, power resides in London, and we'll all go to London and we'll kind of block London up and we'll kind of do a big demo in London. It doesn't really reside in London, not really. Where does that power come from? It comes from local constituencies, and it's determined by the nature of the member of parliament that those local constituencies elect. So how do we deal with it? How do we change that? By changing ordinary people. So those ordinary people, you know, vote in a different way. Not necessarily just in terms of parliament, but in terms of their local authority as well. I mean, local authorities are quite limited in what they can do, but they can still do something to improve the situation. This is why educating people locally at grassroots level is vitally important, and we've never done enough of that. People have wanted to go and shout and protest because that gives them a feeling they've achieved something. It's emotional. When quietly working in a local area to change ordinary people, that's the way that you create change. It's like people haven't dealt with the foundations of the problem, that, you know, people have been looking at trying to deal with the symptoms rather than actually going deep and trying to cure the disease itself. And the disease is the attitudes of ordinary people. And there's a reason why that is the case. There's huge propaganda, you know, coming from the government. I mean, even just look at veganism. There's huge propaganda. You know, you get an advert on the telly, you know, that kind of promotes veganism. Everyone moans and complains, oh, they're vegans and advert vegans. But how many adverts are there for meat? How many for dairy? How many for eggs? Loads. That's the huge swathe of propaganda. You get the odd vegan advert and people complain about it, you know, and they say, oh, that's propaganda. Well, don't they realise that all that's propaganda, all trying to get them to consume animal products? That's propaganda. We're faced with this huge, you know, the power of the media, which is mostly, you know, in favour of big business, in favour of neoliberalism. All the time people are subject to all this propaganda. We haven't got that kind of financial clout to combat that. But what we have got is numbers. What we've got is numbers. When you think of Yeah, those millions of people went to London on the demos, millions of people that turn up at left-wing demonstration. Now it's getting towards tens of thousands of people on the Animal Rights March, or, certainly approaching 10,000 people. We've got the numbers. And what we need to do is use those numbers to counteract the propaganda that's coming from the other side, and work hard in our local areas to spread our message, fundamentally to educate people to go vegan. And by that, I don't mean veganism just in terms of diet, because veganism isn't about diet. Diet's a very important part of it, obviously, a huge important part, but veganism is a philosophy of animal liberation. It's about saying that humans should not oppress animals in any way. And kind of if we get people accepting that philosophy, okay, introduce it to them through diet, that's a good way of doing it, because like the main way most people contribute to animal oppression is through their diet. But it's more than that. And if we get people on board with veganism, that totally changes their worldview, totally changes how they look at everything, and then you're going to have sufficient people, in locally. You're not going to educate everyone, but you're going to have sufficient people that are going to change the political nature of that area. You're going to get much better politicians, because out of all those people that have been enlightened, some of them will want to be politicians, and we need some of them to be politicians. That's really important. There'll be enlightened people to vote for, and enlightened people voting for those people, and we can completely change the makeup of our government. Because we have to do that, because there's only a certain amount we can change by lifestyle. We can change a lot by lifestyle. Like if everyone went vegan in terms of diet, and that'd make a massive difference in terms of animals no longer being slaughtered, and also in terms of the environment. It wouldn't be animal liberation. You'd still have animals, being killed and oppressed in lots of other ways, in ways that it's quite hard for people to do anything about through their lifestyle. It's difficult. You can only change your lifestyle a certain amount, because we live within a system that, to a large extent controls. Like, it'd be great if we could get rid of cars, and cars are hugely harmful in all sorts of ways. But like at the moment, like for loads of people, it's impossible for them to live without using a car, because public transport is so awful, for instance. So, and in order to kind of do anything about that, you've got to have a system change. That's more of a system change thing. So you've got to get the right people in a position to change the system. The two things go hand in hand. Education and politics are the two parts that make the whole of how we totally change things. We have to deal with both of those things at a local level through grassroots activism. It's very difficult for them to do anything about that, you see, because kind of what they've done is they've brought in these measures against people under a cloak of, well, we're dealing with people that break the law. We're dealing with people that break the law. We're dealing with people that break into places. They're criminals. And so we're going to go around taking photos of everyone so that we can catch the ones that are criminals. That's kind of how they, how they kind of justify it. But you see, it's very hard for them. If someone's peacefully campaigning, if someone's peacefully educating other people, it's much harder for them to actually do anything about that. They'd love to be able to. They'd love to bring in laws that said, right, you're not allowed to have a vegan stall. You're not allowed to give out a vegan leaflet. They'd love to do that. That is much, much more difficult for them to do than for them to say, right, we're going to go and arrest ALF activists. It's more difficult for them to kind of get the public on board with them arresting somebody for peacefully giving out a leaflet.
The rationale for the prevent strategy, part of the prevent strategy.
Yeah, it kind of is. It's an attempt to prevent education, but it's still kind of very limited in its scope. Like, we haven't got a situation now where if someone does a stall promoting veganism, that there's a law that says, right, you're an extremist and you're not going to be allowed to do that. I mean, this is something in prevent is aimed at schools, and it's aimed at young people, and it's worrying because of that, because obviously it's really important to educate young people. Once again, it's this kind of gradual erosion. They're trying to gradually creep in with this repression, but it still is very limited, and kind of we do need to fight it combat that. And we do need this closer definition of what is regarded as extremism, so they can no longer do that. And that is really, really important. And kind of any legal people within the vegan movement that are looking at it need to get that enshrined in the kind of regulations for what extremism means in the context to prevent. So that can't happen. I dare say that that's what people are working on in order to prevent, or prevent the kind of wide-ranging scope of prevent that can be used against animal rights people.
Well, of course, the state, the powers and the interest of the state would be to keep those definitions as wide and all-encompassing as possible. If their motivations are, as you've suggested, which I think is probably completely true. So
when you look at it, you see what's more of a threat. What's kind of more of a threat to big business, the neoliberal system that supports it, the values of the Conservative Party and capitalism? What's more of a threat to that? Is it like a few people running around with knives stabbing a few people, a few crazy right-wing people doing stuff? Or is it people that are working for fundamental change, people make it for a fundamental change in the system? So it's all completely different, and all those people that gain materially from the system as it is will no longer do so. Which is the biggest threat? It's the vegan activist who's the biggest threat. The vegan activist is far more of a threat. And in terms of vegan activists, I mean somebody advocating veganism, it's like broad sense of total opposition to all oppression of other animals. That person's a million times more of a threat than a mad jihadi stabber bloke. They're a threat to the kind of like the whole system, and like to lots of people that are making a lot of material gain out of the system. They're the real threat. How do you sell it to ordinary people? How do you get it acceptable that you're going to repress someone that's peacefully giving out leaflets? How would you repress that person? You can't do it directly because people say, well, he's only giving out leaflets about being kind to animals. Why have you dragged that person off and thrown them in prison for 20 years? That's just totally unacceptable. You see, so they know they can't do it that way. So what they do is do it by stealth, adding it on to something else that is acceptable to people. And as I've said, that's historical. They've always done that.
Radical, revolutionary Ronnie. This is Pamela from Animal Justice Emergency. Together, we can organise to end the war on other animals and create animal liberation.